Evelyn Hart was 39 years old, the night her mother decided her younger sister needed her bedroom more than she did. She still had the severance envelope in her tote bag when she pulled into the gravel driveway just after 7, the white paper bent at one corner from how tightly she had held it during the drive home. The sky over Maple Grove was the dull blue-gray of a storm that had not quite made up its mind, and for a strange second, sitting behind the wheel with the engine idling, Evelyn let herself believe she could still walk into that house and be somebody's daughter before she had to become everybody's solution again. She should have known better. There were too many cars in the driveway. Her father's truck, her mother's sedan, Chloe's white Lexus angled badly near the porch like she owned the place, and Mrs. Bell's old Buick tucked in close to the azalea hedge. Company. Witnesses. Evelyn sat there for one more breath, staring at the porch light, then reached for her bag and stepped out into the heavy evening air. The front door was unlocked. She barely made it across the threshold before Chloe's voice sliced through the house from the living room. "So it's true? You really lost your job? Not are you okay? Not what happened. Just that." Evelyn turned toward the sound. Chloe was curled into the corner of the sofa in leggings and an oversized sweatshirt, one hand wrapped around a glass of iced tea, the other still holding her phone, as if this conversation had interrupted something entertaining. Their mother, Marianne Hart, sat beside her with that rigid, composed posture she used whenever she was about to say something cruel, and expected gratitude for saying it calmly. Dee Sylvia occupied the armchair near the lamp, her hands folded tightly in her lap. Mrs. Bell sat by the window, lips pursed over the rim of her teacup, pretending not to watch. Evelyn swallowed. "I was laid off," she said. "There's a difference," Chloe shrugged. "Fine. Laid off. So who's paying my car this month?" The words hung in the room like a slap. For a moment Evelyn thought surely someone would correct her. Her mother would frown. Her aunt would gasp. Her father would step in from the kitchen and tell Chloe to stop acting like a spoiled child, but no one said a word. Mrs. Bell lowered her cup. Dee Sylvia looked down. Marianne only smoothed the crease in her skirt and said, in a tone so level it was almost chilling, "Evelyn, sit down. We need to talk." It was the way people spoke when the decision had already been made. Evelyn did not sit. "How long have you known?" Chloe rolled her eyes. "Mason's cousin works in HR at your firm. People talk. People talk." Evelyn had spent 11 years building a career serious enough to survive audits, hostile clients, and market collapses, and now, the news of her layoff had apparently arrived in her mother's living room before she did. She looked around the room and suddenly saw it as if from outside herself. The tea things set out on coasters, the lemon bars on her mother's floral plate, the neighbor invited in for an audience, the whole thing arranged with the stillness of a scene waiting for its star to fail. From the hallway came the unmistakable scrape of something dragged across hardwood. Evelyn turned. Her father, Dennis Hart, appeared with two large plastic storage bins in his hands. He did not look at her as he passed. He went straight down the hall toward her bedroom like a man late for an appointment he had no intention of missing. Her pulse stumbled. "Dad?" He kept walking. Marianne rose then, smoothing her blouse. "Chloe and Brent are getting serious," she said. "And it's time we start thinking practically. She needs a proper room. You're hardly ever here, and now, with your job situation." She paused just long enough to make it sound merciful. "This arrangement makes more sense." Evelyn stared at her. "You're giving Chloe my room? Don't make this harder than it has to be." By then Dennis had reached the doorway. Evelyn followed him, her heels striking the floor harder with each step, her chest turning cold. When she got there, he was already inside, pulling open her closet with one hand and setting one of the bins on the bed with the other. Her navy blazer lay folded over the chair from that morning. The framed photo from her college graduation, the one thing in the room that proved she had ever belonged anywhere, was gone from the wall. "Dad, stop." He finally turned then, but only halfway, as though full eye contact would cost him more courage than he had. His face was tired, closed off, infuriatingly blank. Chloe needs the room more than you do, he said. And just like that, with her severance papers still in her bag and her whole life still breaking apart inside her, Evelyn understood that losing her job was not going to be the worst thing that happened to her that night. Dennis's voice did not rise. It did not need to. That was the thing about the worst moments in Evelyn's family. They were rarely loud. They arrived in quiet tones, with practical expressions and reasonable words, as if cruelty dressed neatly enough could pass for common sense. She stood in the doorway of her bedroom and looked past her father to the half-open closet, to the bed she had slept in since college, to the pale rectangle on the wall where her graduation photo used to hang. Her first instinct was to argue, to demand an explanation, to ask what kind of mother cleared out her daughter's room before that daughter even made it home after losing her job. But another feeling rose faster than anger. It was older than this night, older than the bins and Chloe's smug silence, and Marianne's folded hands. It was recognition. Because nothing in that house had really begun tonight. What was happening now had been building for years, brick by brick, transfer by transfer. One, just this once, stacked neatly on top of another until Evelyn Hart had become less like a daughter and more like the invisible beam holding the whole house up. At 23, she had thought helping felt like love. She had graduated with honors from a state university in Raleigh, taken an analyst position at a private investment firm in Charlotte, and called home every Sunday with the breathless, eager energy of someone proud to finally be useful. Her first apartment had been tiny and overheated in the summer, with windows that rattled when trucks passed outside. But she remembered feeling rich the first time she wired $500 to her parents and paid her own rent in the same week. Her mother had cried on the phone. Her father had cleared his throat twice before saying, "You didn't have to do that, sweetheart." Chloe, who was still drifting through community college back then, had texted a single row of heart emojis and a screenshot of the groceries she was buying with Evelyn's money. It felt good. Necessary. Noble, even. Then life began making demands, and somehow all of them landed in Evelyn's lap. When Dennis was 56, his diabetes worsened, and the lumber company cut his hours, which meant his insurance got worse right when he needed it more. Marianne had not worked in years, not because she could not, but because she had quietly built a life around being taken care of. Chloe dropped classes, picked up a receptionist job for 3 months, then lost interest in that too. There was always some reason. A bad manager, exhaustion, anxiety, people being unfair. Evelyn listened to each excuse over late-night phone calls from her apartment, then from the townhouse she bought at 30, then from the office parking lot after 12-hour workdays, and she did what she always did. She solved. First it was prescriptions, then specialist visits, then the electric bill 1 month, the water bill the next. Then Dennis missed 2 mortgage payments during a rough winter, and Marianne called in tears so convincing. Evelyn left work early, sat in her car under a parking garage light, and set up the mortgage on autopay before she even started the engine. After that, the money moved every month like clockwork, clean and silent, straight from her account into the house where she still slept in her childhood room on weekends and holidays, like a guest expected to bring gifts. She never kept a full tally, because part of her did not want to know. But once, maybe a year before tonight, she had sat at her kitchen island with a yellow legal pad and added everything up: the mortgage, the insurance premiums, utility spikes in winter, emergency dental work for Chloe, the roof repair after the hailstorm, the down payment on Chloe's car when no bank would approve her without help. By the time Evelyn put her pen down, the number staring back at her was just under $296,000. She had looked at it for a long time, then folded the page in half and tucked it into a drawer. Not because she wanted praise. She did not. Praise would have embarrassed her. What she had wanted, though she could never admit it plainly, even to herself, was something simpler and more childish than recognition. She wanted her family to see her, to understand that every light switch they flipped, every prescription Dennis picked up, every meal Marianne cooked in that kitchen, every mile Chloe put on that shiny white Lexus had passed through Evelyn's hands first. But families can grow used to miracles if they happen on schedule. After enough years, her support no longer looked like sacrifice to them. It looked like background, like plumbing, like air conditioning. Important, certainly, but only noticed when it stopped working. And now, standing in the doorway while her father reached for another armful of clothes, Evelyn felt the final truth settle into place with terrible calm. They had never believed the house stood, because she held it up. They thought it simply stood. They thought it would always stand. That was the reason Marianne could look her in the face on the worst night of her life and speak about practical arrangements. That was why Chloe could worry about her Lexus before asking if her sister had eaten, cried, or broken. In their minds, Evelyn was not a person in crisis. She was infrastructure. And somewhere beneath the shock, beneath the humiliation and the hurt, a hard new thought began to form. If everything in that house had been built on what she gave, then one day soon they were all going to learn what happened when she stopped. That hard thought did not arrive all at once. It moved through Evelyn slowly, like winter settling into old wood, quiet but irreversible. She stood in the doorway of her room while her father lifted another stack of sweaters from the shelf, and for the first time in years, she stopped seeing her family as helpless people she had to rescue and started seeing them as they were. Her mother was not overwhelmed. Marianne was selective. Her father was not confused. Dennis was cowardly. And Chloe, beautiful, drifting, chronically unfinished Chloe, was not fragile at all. She was simply accustomed to being carried. That difference changed everything. It explained why Chloe could quit jobs without panic and still order takeout 3 nights a week. It explained why Marianne always spoke about money as if it appeared through prayer instead of payroll. It explained why Dennis, a man who could spend an hour comparing lawn fertilizer at a hardware store, somehow never knew how much his own mortgage payment was. None of them had needed to know. Evelyn had been knowing it for them. The pattern had hardened over so many years that they no longer even bothered to disguise it as gratitude. She remembered the Lexus, because of course she did. Marianne had called on a Sunday afternoon almost 2 years earlier, with that careful, soft tone she used whenever she was about to hand Evelyn a burden and pretend it was an honor. Chloe's old car had finally died in a grocery store parking lot, and now Chloe needed something dependable, something safe, something she could drive to work and church and appointments. Evelyn had listened for a full 5 minutes before asking the only question that mattered. How much has Chloe saved? Silence. Then Marianne, lightly, as though the answer barely mattered. Well, not much at the moment. Not much had meant almost nothing. Chloe had spent what little she had on hair appointments, weekend trips with friends, and a designer bag she claimed she bought on sale. Her credit was terrible. Her employment history was patchwork. The dealership had offered terms that were laughable unless someone with stable income and excellent credit stepped in. Evelyn had said no that first day, calmly, clearly. She would help with a down payment, she said. But she would not co-sign a $30,000 loan for a woman in her 30s who treated responsibility like an optional hobby. Marianne did not yell. She never needed to. What followed was worse, a campaign of wounded silence. No calls for 9 days, no Sunday dinner invitation. Chloe posting a quote online about betrayal and fake family. Dennis sending a single text. Your mother's upset, without once asking whether Evelyn might have a reason to be upset too. Then Pastor Helen mentioned after church, with pained kindness, that family was a sacred burden and strong women had a duty not to let weaker ones fall. Evelyn had stood there in the church foyer holding a paper cup of weak coffee, realizing her private refusal had somehow been carried into public as moral failure. That had been Marianne's genius. She did not force. She arranged. She let shame do the heavy lifting. Evelyn had co-signed 3 days later. She could still remember the exact feeling of sitting in the dealership office under fluorescent lights, while Chloe bounced her foot beside her, already talking about seat color and sunroof packages, as if the financial obligation being stapled to Evelyn's name were a decorative detail. The salesman had smiled at Evelyn with the relieved warmth people reserved for the adult in the room. Chloe drove home in that white Lexus crying happy tears. Marianne made pot roast that night and kissed Evelyn on the cheek as if this were what daughters were for. Dennis carved the meat and said, "You know your sister. She just needs a little help getting started." A little help. Evelyn had signed her name beneath 7 years of payments. And still, even then, something inside her had shifted. It had not been dramatic. No thunderclap. No grand declaration. Just a small private recoil she barely understood at the time. Because that had also been the week she started taking late evening calls in her townhouse office with Noah Bennett, a former colleague from a corporate restructuring project who had been telling her for months that she was wasting her instincts making rich men richer. Noah had a voice like rough cedar and a habit of speaking plainly enough to make excuses sound ridiculous. "Start your own firm," he had told her more than once. "Build something for yourself for a change." The night she co-signed Chloe's Lexus, Evelyn called him back. "I'm in," she said. Noah did not ask for an explanation. "Good," he replied. "I already know what you can do. The question is whether you're finally ready to know it too." She had not told her family about those calls. Not because she intended to deceive them, but because none of them ever asked what she wanted, only what she could provide. They did not ask why she stayed up late with spreadsheets open past midnight. They did not ask why she had started flying to Florida every other month. They did not ask why she had become quieter over the past year, more watchful, harder to guilt. To notice any of that, they would have had to look at her as a whole person. Instead, they kept using the old script. Evelyn is capable. Evelyn will handle it. Evelyn always comes through. Now, as Dennis placed another armful of her clothes into the plastic bin and Chloe laughed faintly somewhere down the hall at something on her phone, Evelyn understood the ugliest part of all. Her family had not become cruel in a single night. They had become cruel by practice, by repetition, by years of discovering that every time they reached into her life and took, she found a way to call it love. Not this time. The thought landed in her with a steadiness that surprised her. She did not say it aloud. Not yet. But somewhere, beneath the humiliation, beneath the ache of watching her place in that house disappear, item by item, a line was being drawn. And before the night was over, they were going to cross it. That line had been forming long before anyone in that house noticed it. And the strangest part was that Evelyn had already begun building a life on the other side of it. While Marianne measured daughters by usefulness and Chloe treated adulthood like a costume she could slip in and out of, Evelyn had been doing what she always did best. Working quietly, planning carefully, moving pieces into place long before anyone realized a new game had begun. 3 years earlier, after one too many weekends spent fixing financial disasters she had not created, she had started flying to Florida under the polite fiction of client meetings. That was true, technically. What nobody in Maple Grove knew was that some of those meetings happened inside a narrow glass-walled office 2 blocks from the marina in Gulfport, where a brass plaque on a temporary suite door read Hart and Bennett Advisory. Noah Bennett had found the space first. He had sent her 3 photos and a message that said, "It smells like old coffee and ambition. Perfect for a startup." Evelyn had laughed out loud at her phone for the first time in weeks. Noah had that effect on her. He was sharp without being slick, confident without the performance of confidence, and he trusted competence the way other people trusted charisma. Where Evelyn saw risk, he saw structure. Where she hesitated, he translated fear into math. Their first year had been small and relentless. They took the clients bigger firms ignored. Family restaurants whose books were bleeding in 6 places at once, roofing companies drowning in debt from bad equipment leases, a dentist with 3 locations and no retirement plan worth the paper it was printed on. Evelyn handled cash flow strategy, tax exposure, debt restructuring. Noah built relationships, closed deals, and somehow made exhausted business owners feel less ashamed of needing help. They worked nights, weekends, airport layovers, early mornings before her corporate job in Charlotte, and somehow the thing kept growing. By the end of year 1, they had enough recurring revenue to hire 2 analysts. By the middle of year 2, They had 6 employees, a leased office with exposed brick, and more work than either of them could gracefully pretend was manageable. The company did not make Evelyn rich. Not yet. But it made her something she had not realized she was starving for. Separate. Separate from Marianne's moods. Separate from Chloe's emergencies. Separate from the constant family assumption that her life existed mainly as reserve currency for theirs. In Gulfport, nobody knew her as the dependable daughter. There, she was the woman clients asked for by name, the one who could walk into a chaotic business and tell, within 20 minutes, which numbers were lying and which ones were simply drowning. She liked the precision of it, the honesty. Numbers could hurt you, but they never pretended not to. And then there was the beach house. Even now, standing in the doorway of her room while Dennis folded another blouse into a plastic bin as if he were packing up a stranger's things, Evelyn felt almost detached when she thought about it. 18 months earlier, a client in Clearwater had been liquidating a handful of inherited properties after a brutal probate fight. One of them was a small weathered beach house on the quieter end of the shoreline, not luxurious, not glamorous, but sturdy, sun-faded, and set back just enough from the water to feel private. The previous owner had neglected it. The floors needed refinishing, the plumbing had attitude, and the kitchen looked like it had not updated its beliefs since 1998. But the bones were solid. The price was low because the family wanted speed. Noah had called her that afternoon and said, "Don't overthink this, buy the house." She almost had not. It felt indulgent, irresponsible even, to own something no one needed from her. Then, she ran the numbers. The mortgage was manageable. The location was excellent. The long-term value was obvious. She could use it as a second work base while they expanded along the coast, and if everything failed, she could sell it later at a profit. She signed before she could talk herself out of it. She spent weekends there with a contractor named Luis, replacing cabinet doors, repainting walls, choosing durable furniture that would survive both salt air and exhaustion. The first night she slept there alone, with the windows cracked open to the sound of waves pushing against the dark, she had woken at 3 in the morning and sat up in bed with the strangest sensation pressing on her chest. Peace. Not joy, exactly. Peace was quieter than joy, less dramatic and far more dangerous to a woman who had spent half her life confusing usefulness with love. In that beach house, there were no guilt-ridden phone calls waiting by the coffee pot, no door slamming because Chloe had not gotten her way, no Marianne sighing into the silence, until everyone around her felt morally defective. The air smelled like salt and clean paint. The sheets stayed where she left them. Her thoughts did too. She had not hidden any of this from her family in the deliberate, secretive way they would later accuse her of. She had simply stopped narrating her life to people who did not listen unless money was involved. Marianne never asked why Evelyn had started traveling more often. Dennis never asked why she sometimes answered work calls with a confidence and authority he had never heard from her around the dinner table. Chloe never asked anything unless it ended in a dollar amount. So the details remained where they were safest outside that house, beyond their reach, growing in sunlight they had not earned. By the time her corporate firm laid her off that morning, Hart and Bennett was already strong enough to catch her. Noah had been telling her for 6 months that she no longer needed the old job. She had stayed for the insurance, for caution, for habit. But the truth was, if she had gotten on a plane that night, she could have been in Gulfport by morning and at her own desk by noon. That was the part her family did not know. They thought they were throwing out a woman who had just lost everything. They had no idea they were pushing out the one person in that house who already had somewhere else to go and a front door on the coast with her name on the deed. But standing there in the doorway of her bedroom, Evelyn did not say any of that. She did not tell her mother about the office in Gulfport, or the clients waiting for her, or the beach house with the seagrass brushing the back fence, and the pale blue shutters she had painted herself on a humid Sunday in April. She did not tell Chloe that the room she was so eager to claim was smaller than the life Evelyn had already built without any of them noticing. She did not tell her father that, by morning, she could be somewhere none of them could touch. Instead, she looked around the room that had once been hers and understood, with a coldness that surprised her, how carefully this had all been arranged. Half the closet was already empty. Her winter coats were gone from the far rail. 2 pairs of shoes had been shoved into one of the bins without tissue paper or care. The ceramic tray on her dresser, the one Grandma Louise had given her on her 21st birthday, had been turned sideways, earrings tangled beneath it like scraps. And on the wall above the bed, the pale square where her framed graduation photo used to hang, glared back at her harder than anything else in the room. That was the wound. Not the bin. Not even Chloe's voice in the living room. It was that blank patch of wall. Someone had taken the photo down before Evelyn ever got home. Before she stepped through the front door, with her severance papers still folded in her bag. Before she had the chance to explain, to breathe, to sit at the kitchen table and hear one soft lie about how everything would be okay. Her mother had already stood in this room, looked at that image of her eldest daughter in a cap and gown, smiling into a future she had paid for herself, and decided it no longer belonged on the wall. "You went through my things this afternoon," Evelyn said, her voice flatter than she felt. Marianne appeared behind her in the doorway, one hand resting lightly against the trim as if she were entering a room in a stranger's house. "I started making space," she said. "There was no point waiting. No point waiting." Dennis kept folding. A sweater, a pair of jeans, the blue cardigan Evelyn wore on flights because airports were always colder than they looked. He moved slowly, deliberately, as though if he handled her clothes gently enough, that might count as kindness. Evelyn turned to face her mother. "You knew I'd been laid off before I got here." Marianne's chin lifted half an inch. "People in town heard. That wasn't my question." A sharp little silence stretched between them. Down the hall, Chloe laughed at something on her phone, then called out, "Mom, do you think blush curtains would look weird with the cream rug?" As if this were a room makeover. As if Evelyn were already gone. Marianne didn't even turn her head. "Not blush," she replied. "Something warmer." Evelyn stared at her. It was such a small exchange, so ordinary on its surface, but something about it made the whole night tilt into focus. Chloe had already chosen colors, her mother had already agreed. They had not reacted to bad news in panic, they had planned around it. They had spent the afternoon reassigning Evelyn's life the way people reshuffle furniture after deciding a guest has overstayed. "When exactly did you decide this?" Evelyn asked. "This morning." The answer came too quickly to soften. "This morning," Evelyn repeated. "While I was still cleaning out my desk?" Marianne crossed her arms. "You're making this dramatic." "No," Evelyn said. "You packed my room before I came home to tell you I lost my job." "That job is gone," her mother snapped, the first crack in her polished composure. "And whether you like it or not, this family has to think ahead." "This family." Evelyn almost laughed, but the sound never made it out of her throat. She thought ahead for this family. She had been thinking ahead for them for 14 years. She was the one who knew due dates, policy numbers, late fees, deductible thresholds, loan terms, grocery shortages, electricity spikes in January, and which pharmacy charged $17 less for Dennis's insulin if you used the mail order portal instead of the local pickup. Marianne spoke about this family as if she chaired it. In truth, she merely lived inside the structure Evelyn kept from collapsing. Dennis set another stack of clothes into the bin and finally said, without looking at her, "Chloe and Brent are talking about engagement." Evelyn turned to him. "And that means she gets my room the night I get laid off?" He said nothing. Marianne stepped in for him, because of course she did. "It means Chloe is building a future. You," her gaze flicked down to the tote bag still hanging from Evelyn's shoulder, "need flexibility right now." Flexibility. It was the sort of word that sounded practical until you looked closely and realized it meant disposable. Evelyn walked past her father to the dresser and pulled open the top drawer. Empty except for 2 loose bobby pins and an old receipt. The second drawer held nothing but a wrinkled scarf and a cracked hand lotion bottle she had thrown out months ago. Her jewelry box sat near the lamp, lid half open, as though someone had checked it for value. She picked it up and felt the hinge catch. From the hallway, Mrs. Bell's voice floated in, low and eager. "Everything all right in there?" Marianne turned just enough to answer, "We're handling it." Handling it. With an audience. That humiliation burned hotter than Evelyn expected. Not just because the neighbor would talk, though she would, by breakfast, and probably embellish it by lunch, but because Marianne had allowed witnesses, maybe even wanted them. A room full of silent people turned cruelty into consensus. If enough others stood around and said nothing, then perhaps what was happening could pass as reasonable. Evelyn set the jewelry box carefully into the bin, and looked once more at the pale square on the wall where her photo had been. That blank space told the truth better than anyone in the room ever would. They had not just made space for Chloe. They had erased Evelyn first. That was the thought that stayed with her as she stood in the middle of the room, one hand resting on the edge of the dresser, staring at the pale shape on the wall where her graduation picture used to be. A missing photograph should not have hurt more than losing a job, more than watching her father fold her clothes into plastic bins, more than hearing her sister discuss curtain colors for a room that had still been Evelyn's that morning. But it did. Because the photograph was proof of something her family had been quietly dismantling for years, that she had once been seen here not just as useful, but as worthy. And the worst part was that she had been just days away from giving them more. 2 weeks earlier, sitting in the Gulfport office after Noah had left for the evening, Evelyn had opened a folder on her laptop labeled, "For Mom and Dad." It contained a drafted letter and a spreadsheet, with one highlighted number near the bottom. $87,430.12. That was the remaining balance on the Maple Grove mortgage, calculated down to the cent after the next payment cleared. She knew, because she knew everything about that house. The escrow fluctuation from last year's tax reassessment, the insurance premium increase after the hail claim, the exact date the rate would adjust if they ever missed enough payments to trigger a review. She knew that house more intimately than the people who lived in it. She had stared at the total for a long time that night, then leaned back in her chair and pictured how she would do it. By September, if Hart and Bennett closed the resort consulting contract Noah was chasing, and 2 smaller retainers renewed on schedule, she would finally resign from the old corporate life for good. She would move fully to Florida. And before she left North Carolina behind, she would pay off her parents' mortgage in one wire transfer and hand them the letter in person. Not because they had earned it. If she had been honest with herself, she would have admitted long ago that they had not. She wanted to do it because she had spent half her life trying to turn love into something measurable, and eliminating their debt felt like a final clean sentence. A way to leave without bitterness, a way to tell herself she had done everything she could. The letter had been simple. She could still remember some of the lines because she had revised them 3 times, trying to make them warm without sounding foolish. "I wanted to give you peace in this house. I hope you use it to be kinder to one another. Take care of Dad. Take care of yourselves." There had been no accusation in it. No ledger of what she had already paid. No mention of Chloe's car, or Dennis's insulin, or the years Evelyn had quietly rerouted her own life around everyone else's emergencies. She had not wanted gratitude. She had wanted release. Now, with Marianne standing in the doorway and Dennis pressing the lid down on a half-filled bin, the memory of that letter felt so humiliating she almost flushed with it. She had been planning to save them while they were planning to remove her. The thought made the room sharpen around the edges. Evelyn bent and picked up the second bin from the floor. The plastic was heavier than she expected, crowded with shoes, books, a framed print she had bought in Charleston, and the old quilt Grandma Louise had sewn for her high school graduation. It had been shoved in without folding, one corner pinched beneath a stack of jeans. She fixed it automatically, smoothing the fabric with her palm before lifting the container. Marianne watched her. "You don't need to make this into a scene." Evelyn looked up slowly. "A scene? You know what I mean." "No," Evelyn thought. "I know exactly what you mean." Marianne meant dignity was acceptable only as long as it remained silent. Pain was allowed in that house if it was discreet, tidy, and did not inconvenience anyone else's version of events. Evelyn could cry later in private if she wanted. What she was not supposed to do was force anyone in this room to witness themselves clearly. She carried the first bin into the hallway. Chloe was leaning against the far wall, scrolling through a home decor website, one socked foot crossed over the other. "Can you leave the vanity mirror?" she asked without looking up. "It'll match the rug I'm ordering." Evelyn stopped. There were moments when fury arrives hot and wild, asking for noise. This was not one of them. What she felt instead was colder, cleaner, almost surgical. "No," she said. Chloe blinked up at her, startled less by the refusal than by the fact that one had been spoken at all. "That mirror is mine." Chloe's mouth tightened. Wow. Mrs. Bell, still in the living room, pretended to be deeply interested in the spoon on her saucer. Sylvia rose halfway from her chair, then sat back down again, guilt written all over her face. Dennis came out behind Evelyn with the second bin in his arms. He looked older suddenly. Not softer, just older, as though participating in this had cost him something he had not expected to spend. At the front door, Evelyn set the first bin down and reached into her tote for her keys. The severance envelope brushed her fingers. For one strange second, she almost laughed at the absurdity of carrying two different endings in the same bag. In one timeline, she had gone home to break bad news, and maybe, if the night had been merciful, to be held together by family. In the other, the real one, she was standing on the threshold of a house she had financially supported for years, holding boxes packed by the people who owed their comfort to her, while a letter that would have wiped out their debt no longer had any place in the world. When Dennis stepped onto the porch behind her, she turned back once, not because she expected him to stop her, but because some bruised part of her still needed to see whether he would try. He set the second bin beside the first, and finally met her eyes. "Your mother thought this was best," he said quietly. Evelyn stared at him, the night air thick and damp around them. Then she slipped her hand into her bag, found her phone, and thought of the folder on her laptop waiting back in Gulfport. "For Mom and Dad. Not anymore." The words moved through Evelyn's mind with a strange, steady force as she opened the trunk and slid the first bin inside. Dennis remained on the porch behind her, hands hanging at his sides, shoulders slightly bent, as if he wanted credit for being uncomfortable without having to do anything that might actually change the outcome. The porch light threw a yellow half-circle onto the gravel, catching the dust on his work boots and the deep crease between his brows. For one second, one humiliating, reflexive second, Evelyn thought he might say her name differently. Not as a warning, not as a tired obligation, but as a father. He didn't. Inside the house, Chloe's voice floated toward the open door. "Mom, do you think Brent's mom will like the room better if we move the bed under the window?" Move the bed. Evelyn's bed. In the room Chloe had not even waited a full hour to claim. Marianne answered from somewhere near the hallway, her tone brisk, composed, already stepping into tomorrow. "Yes, but we need to clear the dresser first." The dresser first. Evelyn shut the trunk harder than she meant to. The sound cracked through the warm dark and sent a bird lifting from the oak tree near the mailbox. Mrs. Bell's Buick was still in the driveway. Sylvia had not come outside. Of course she hadn't. In families like this, witnesses preferred remorse after the fact. It was tidier than courage in the moment. Dennis cleared his throat. "You'll be all right." There it was again, the family blessing and curse in one sentence. "You'll be all right." The phrase they gave her whenever they wanted to avoid the uglier truth, which was that they were choosing not to care because caring would cost them something. Evelyn rested both palms on the trunk lid and looked at him over the roof of the car. "Is that what you tell yourself?" she asked quietly. "That I'll be all right, so none of this counts?" He flinched, not visibly enough that anyone else might have noticed, but she did. She had spent her whole life studying the small reactions in that house, because the loud ones were rare. Dennis opened his mouth, then closed it. Somewhere inside, Chloe laughed again, and the sound settled everything. Evelyn got into the driver's seat without another word. No one came down the steps to stop her. No one leaned in through the window to ask where she was going, whether she had somewhere safe to sleep, whether she had eaten since noon, whether she needed help carrying the rest of her things. She started the engine, and the headlights swept across the porch, catching Marianne for the first time. She had appeared in the doorway with her arms folded, watching as Evelyn backed down the driveway. Not crying. Not shaken. Just watching. As if this were a difficult but necessary correction to the household order. Evelyn looked at her mother once through the windshield, then she drove away. She made it 12 miles before the road blurred. Maple Grove fell behind her in a dark ribbon of trees and low buildings, the town shrinking in the rear view, until all that remained were broken patches of porch light and the occasional gas station sign humming against the roadside. She drove on instinct at first, one hand tight on the wheel, the other pressed against her mouth so hard her teeth marked her skin. The severance envelope slid off the passenger seat at a red light and landed upside down on the floor mat with a papery slap. She left it there. A cheap motel sign appeared near the interstate exit, half the letters in vacancy burned out. Evelyn almost turned in, then kept driving. She could not bear fluorescent bedding and lukewarm pity from a night clerk who would call her ma'am and not look too closely. 10 minutes later, she pulled into a 24-hour gas station instead, parked beside an ice machine, and turned the engine off. Silence rushed in. For a while, she just sat there with both hands on the steering wheel, staring at her own reflection in the dark windshield. Her mascara had not run. Her blouse was still buttoned straight. From the outside, she looked exactly like the woman who had left for work that morning, controlled, polished, capable. It almost made her angry, how invisible pain could be when it stayed contained. Then her phone lit up. Noah. The name on the screen undid her more quickly than anything else had. Evelyn answered on the first ring, but could not speak. He understood anyway. "You still in North Carolina?" She shut her eyes. For the moment. "That bad?" She let out one laugh, small and wrecked. "They packed my room before I got home." There was a pause on the line. Not because he did not believe her, but because Noah Bennett had the rare discipline of actually absorbing what he heard before responding. When he spoke again, his voice had gone lower, rougher. "All right, listen to me. I can book you on the first flight out tomorrow morning. Gulfport, Tampa, wherever gets you closest. You don't need to stay there another night." Another night. As if there were any version of reality in which she would go back. Evelyn looked through the windshield at the neon glow of the gas station storefront, the racks of chips, the sleepy teenager behind the counter, the ordinary life of people who had no idea a woman in a dark sedan had just been exiled from a house she had practically paid for. "I've got boxes in the car," she said. "Then drive somewhere safe, sleep a few hours if you can, and let me handle the rest." Something in his certainty reached her, where comfort could not. Noah never offered emotional speeches, he offered structure. Next steps. A bridge from chaos to the next morning. For years, Evelyn had been that bridge for everyone else. She had not realized how exhausted she was until someone else quietly became one for her. She tipped her head back against the seat and finally let herself cry. Not loudly, not beautifully, just a hard, silent breaking that left her shaking in the dark while truck headlights moved through the lot in blurred white streaks. She cried for the job, yes, but mostly for the room, for the blank square on the wall, for the fact that Chloe had probably already dragged her comforter halfway off the bed by now, making plans with Brent, talking about rugs and curtains as if Evelyn had never lived there at all. When the worst of it passed, she wiped her face with the heel of her hand and looked at the time. 9:43 p.m. Inside the house she had just left, they were probably discussing paint colors. Inside the beach house in Florida, there were clean sheets, salt air, and a front door only she could open. Evelyn drew in a long breath, then another. "Book the flight," she told Noah. "I'm done." The words stayed with Evelyn long after the call ended, following her through the rest of that night and into the thin gray light of morning. Noah booked her on a 7:10 a.m. flight out of Charlotte with a connection that would get her to Florida before noon. She drove to a motel near the airport, slept maybe 90 minutes in stiff white sheets that smelled faintly of bleach, and was back on the road before sunrise with 2 storage bins, a tote bag, and the kind of exhaustion that sat behind her ribs like a bruise. By noon, she was standing on the front porch of the beach house in Clearwater with a key in her hand and salt wind moving through her hair. The place looked exactly the way she needed it to look: plain, sun, washed, and entirely hers. Pale blue shutters. A narrow porch with chipped white railings she kept meaning to repaint. A line of dune grass behind the fence, bending toward the water. Inside, the floor still creaked near the kitchen, and one cabinet door refused to hang straight, no matter what Louise did with the hinges. But the air smelled clean. The windows were open. Light lay across the living room in soft gold bands. And for the first time, in nearly 24 hours, Evelyn could hear herself think. She set the bins just inside the entryway and stood there for a long moment, not moving. Nobody in Maple Grove had asked where she slept that night. Nobody had texted to make sure she arrived somewhere safe. No one had called to say the fight got out of hand, or your mother didn't mean it, or your father feels terrible, or at the very least, did you make it okay? Their silence had followed her all the way down the coast, and somehow that hurt more in daylight. Cruelty could be explained away as emotion. Silence took planning. Noah stopped by an hour later with sandwiches, coffee, and a spare office key on a ring that said HBA Coastal. He did not ask if she wanted to talk first. He handed her the coffee, looked at the bins by the wall, and said, "You can stay here as long as you need. The office is ready when you are." Evelyn almost smiled. "That's your version of tenderness, isn't it?" "It's a strong version," he said, and that got a real laugh out of her, brief but genuine. The next morning she went into the Gulfport office, answered emails, joined a client call, revised a restructuring proposal, and signed off on payroll. Her world had split open. Yet the numbers still made sense. That steadied her. Work did not ask her to prove she deserved to exist before it allowed her usefulness. Work simply met her where her skill was. By the third day, the shock had begun to harden into something more practical. On the fourth, she opened her banking app. The auto payments were still running. Mortgage, $2,180. Dennis's health insurance premium, $690. Chloe's Lexus payment, $720. The co-signed credit card minimum, $310. A total of $3,900 a month continued flowing out of Evelyn's account and into a household that had boxed up her life before she got home from losing her job. She stared at the screen so long, it dimmed. Noah, leaning against the office doorway with a yellow file in one hand, watched her expression change. "What? I'm still paying for everything." He was quiet for half a second, then stepped inside and set the file on her desk. "Tell me you're joking." She turned the phone toward him. He read the line items, jaw tightening by the second. "Evelyn, I know." "No, I don't think you do." He straightened and looked at her with that blunt, infuriating clarity she both valued and occasionally wanted to throw something at. "They threw you out? And you're still funding the house they threw you out of?" She locked the screen and set the phone down face first. "I haven't had time to deal with it. That's not what this is." Of course it wasn't. She knew that. This was not about timing or paperwork. This was about a part of her still waiting against evidence, against dignity, against basic logic for someone to call and say they were sorry. A mother, a father, even Chloe, though that felt like a weaker fantasy. Some stupid, hopeful piece of Evelyn still believed an apology might arrive if she gave them enough room. It didn't. 19 days passed. 19 full days in which Marianne did not call to ask where her daughter was living. Dennis did not leave a message. Chloe did not ask if Evelyn had a job lined up, or a bed, or a reason she sounded different when she answered work calls. The family group chat remained active the whole time, and against her better judgment, Evelyn opened it once on a Thursday night. Chloe had posted a photo of the bedroom. Her bedroom, the walls had been repainted a warm cream. The vanity mirror, apparently not the one Evelyn refused to leave, stood by the window beside a ring light and a vase of fake peonies. Finally feels like mine, Chloe had captioned it, followed by a white heart. Marianne had replied 3 minutes later. It looks beautiful, sweetheart. Evelyn put the phone down so carefully it scared her more than anger would have. The call came the next morning while she was on the back porch of the beach house, barefoot, coffee in hand, the ocean moving in low silver waves beyond the fence. Chloe's name flashed across the screen. For one terrible second, hope rose anyway. Evelyn answered. Hello? Chloe didn't bother with one. Hey, so the insurance on my car is due Monday. Don't forget, okay? Brent's parents invited us to dinner and I can't show up without it. Evelyn stood very still, the coffee cooling between her fingers. 19 days. And that was the first thing her sister had to say. Evelyn did not answer right away. She stood on the back porch of the beach house, with the phone pressed to her ear and the ocean moving in slow, indifferent waves beyond the fence, and she let the silence stretch until Chloe grew irritated by it. Hello? Chloe said. Are you there? Yes, Evelyn replied. Okay, good. So, can you just make sure it goes through before Monday? Brent's mom is already weird about appearances, and I'm not about to show up in some borrowed car looking like my life is falling apart. The sentence landed with such perfect, effortless selfishness that something inside Evelyn finally went still. Not shattered, not inflamed, still. She thought of the repainted bedroom, the cream walls, the ring light by the window. She thought of her mother commenting, "It looks beautiful, sweetheart," beneath a photo of a room cleared out before its owner had even made it home with the worst news of her adult life. She thought of 19 full days in which no one had asked if she was sleeping on a couch, in a motel, in her car, or under a bridge for all they knew. And now Chloe wanted car insurance. Do you know where I am? Evelyn asked. Chloe gave a quick laugh. Not exactly. Noahville? Sadness County? I don't know, Evelyn. Do I need your coordinates to get one payment handled? Evelyn closed her eyes once, then opened them to the bright Florida light. I'm in Clearwater. So? So I left the state nearly 3 weeks ago. A pause. Okay, Chloe said, in the tone of someone absorbing trivia. Well, can you still pay it? That was the moment. Not the boxes. Not the missing photograph. Not even Dennis standing on the porch and telling her mother thought this was best. This was the moment. Because if cruelty had hollowed out the old structure, then this call revealed what had been underneath it all along. There was no bottom to their entitlement. There would never be a day bad enough, humiliating enough, lonely enough to interrupt the expectation that Evelyn would continue functioning as the family's emergency fund with a pulse. No, she said. The word fell between them, simple and clean. Chloe laughed again, but there was strain in it now. No what? No, I'm not paying it. What do you mean, you're not paying it? I mean exactly that. For a second, Chloe was silent, as if she genuinely could not process the shape of refusal in her sister's mouth. Then the outrage arrived, right on schedule. Are you kidding me? You co-signed that car. Yes, Evelyn said. And I've made 18 months of payments on something I told you not to buy in the first place. That is not the point. It's the only point. Chloe inhaled sharply. Mom said you were upset, but I didn't realize you were going to be petty. Bettu. Evelyn almost admired the audacity of it. She looked out at the water, at the line where sea met sky, and felt a quiet, irreversible click inside herself. Tell Mom to check her email, she said, and ended the call. She went straight inside, set her coffee on the kitchen counter, and opened her laptop. By the time Noah arrived at the office 40 minutes later, she had already drafted the subject line. Financial transition. 30-day. Notice. He stood in the doorway, reading over her shoulder, while she revised the second paragraph. That, he said after a moment, is the politest execution I've ever seen. Evelyn did not smile. Her hands were steady on the keyboard now, steadier than they had been in weeks. She wrote the way she handled distressed accounts and difficult clients, clearly, specifically, with no emotional openings for manipulation. The email listed each payment in separate lines. Mortgage on the Maple Grove property. Final payment to be made this month. No further payments after that date. Dennis Hart's health insurance premium. Continued for 45 additional days to allow time for alternative coverage enrollment. Lexus auto loan and related insurance. All support ending at month's close. Co-signed credit card minimums. No further payments to be made by Evelyn Hart. Then she added the sentence that mattered most. This is not a punishment. It is a boundary. She sent it to Marianne, Dennis, and Chloe together. For a long second after clicking send, she just sat there watching the tiny paper airplane icon disappear from the screen. 15 years of checks, transfers, auto payments, rescue plans, quiet panic, strategic budgeting, and emotional extortion compressed into one clean email with a professional tone and no room for debate. It felt less like anger than accounting. A ledger finally closed. The fallout began before lunch. Her phone lit up first with Marianne's name. Evelyn let it ring, then Chloe, then Dennis. By noon, she had 11 missed calls and 9 text messages. Marianne's came in blocks, each one more indignant than the last. Call me immediately. You do not make decisions like this by email. How dare you blindside your family? After everything we've done for you. Evelyn stopped reading there. Chloe's messages were less polished and more honest. What the fuck is this? You can't just ruin my life. Because you're bitter. Brent's parents are coming Tuesday. Do you know how humiliating this is for me? Dennis left one voicemail. She listened to it in the empty conference room, with the sound turned low. Evelyn, he said, voice thick with discomfort. Your mother is very upset. Maybe you should call. Not, are you all right? Not, I'm sorry. Not, we handled this badly. Just your mother is upset. As if Evelyn's role in the family remained what it had always been. Absorber of consequences, regulator of Marianne's emotions, quiet fixer of messes other people made with both hands. Noah found her 20 minutes later standing by the conference room window, phone still in her hand. Well? He asked. Evelyn looked down at the screen, at the stack of missed calls and unanswered outrage, and felt something surprising bloom beneath the grief. Relief. They noticed, she said. Noah's mouth curved slightly. Funny how fast people notice when the money stops. Evelyn set the phone face down on the table. Outside, the Florida sun blazed against the marina glass, bright enough to hurt if you stared too long. Inside, for the first time in years, she did not feel like someone waiting to be summoned back into service. She felt like a woman who had finally chosen herself and sent the invoice for everyone else's illusion the moment it expired. The response from Maple Grove came fast, messy, and exactly as revealing as Evelyn had expected. By the next morning, Marianne had left 4 voicemails, each one carefully balanced between outrage and self-pity, as if she still believed those two things together could drag Evelyn back into line. Chloe switched tactics every few hours, cycling from fury to pleading to accusation and back again. Dennis remained the most consistent of them all, which was to say he stayed mostly absent, except when Marianne needed him to serve as the family's softer messenger. It might have worked once. It did not work now. What surprised Evelyn was not their panic. It was how quickly that panic spilled beyond the family. 3 days after the email, Dee Sylvia called. Evelyn was at her desk reviewing a proposal for a coastal hotel group when her phone vibrated. She almost ignored it, thinking it would be another message from home, but when she saw her aunt's name, she answered. Sylvia's voice arrived low and hesitant, carrying the exhausted guilt of someone who had watched a line get crossed and hated herself for staying seated. Your mother's been talking, Sylvia said. Evelyn leaned back in her chair. To who? To everybody who'll listen. Of course she had. Marianne Hart did not process humiliation privately. She exported it. According to Sylvia, Marianne had already told half her church circle that Evelyn's email was proof she had become cold and prideful after losing her job. The story had shifted, as those stories always did, into something cleaner for public use. Evelyn had not been thrown out. No. Marianne was saying Evelyn had become unstable after the layoff, overreacted to a family discussion, and now wanted to punish everyone because she could not handle disappointment. Chloe, meanwhile, had posted a vague status online about people who care more about money than blood, which drew the predictable flood of sympathy from women who knew half a version of the story and felt entitled to all of it. Evelyn closed her eyes briefly. And people are believing her? Sylvia hesitated. Some are, some aren't. Pastor Helen said families go through seasons, and we should all pray for humility. The words almost made Evelyn laugh. Not because they were funny, but because Marianne had once again managed to turn exploitation into a morality tale with herself cast as the injured party. That had always been her gift. She could stand in the middle of someone else's sacrifice and make it look, from the right angle, like her own suffering. There's more, Sylvia said softly. Your mother didn't know the mortgage was over $2,000 a month. Evelyn sat forward. What? She thought it was around 800, maybe 1,000. Sylvia sounded embarrassed on Marianne's behalf and angry at herself for still being shocked. She never asked. She just assumed. That landed harder than it should have. Not because Evelyn expected Marianne to know the exact amount, though, after 5 years of Evelyn paying it. Perhaps that was not too much to ask, but because of what the ignorance revealed. Marianne had accepted enormous help so completely, so casually, that she had never even bothered to understand its scale. She had treated Evelyn's labor the way people treat electricity. Expensive in theory, invisible in practice, and only worth thinking about once the lights went out. By the end of the week, the lights were flickering everywhere. Chloe's Lexus payment failed first, then the insurance draft bounced. Marianne called twice more that Friday, no longer indignant, just sharp with rising fear. Evelyn did not answer. Dennis finally left a voicemail that went beyond. Call your mother, and into the edges of something like confession. The bank sent a notice, he said. About the mortgage. It says if we don't contact them by the end of the month. He stopped there, as if even finishing the sentence might make it more real. I know you sent that email. Your mother thought you'd calm down. Calm down. Evelyn listened to the message twice, and then sat in silence, the phone still in her hand. That was what Marianne had believed. Not that Evelyn meant it. Not that boundaries could exist. Not that the woman who had spent 15 years saving everyone might one day stop. Marianne had believed this was a mood. A storm to outlast. An emotional inconvenience. She had not read the email as a final decision because she had never truly accepted that Evelyn was allowed to make final decisions at all. Noah found Evelyn late that afternoon in the records room, with 2 bankers' boxes open on the table. Inside were printed statements, insurance records, loan documents, and old payment confirmations she had requested from the archives that morning. He looked from the papers to her face. You building a war file? I'm building clarity. He nodded once. Same thing, sometimes. Camila, their office manager, helped her assemble the rest. Mortgage drafts going back 5 years. Premium payments for Dennis's insurance. The signed co-borrower paperwork on Chloe's Lexus. Credit card statements showing minimum payments made from Evelyn's personal checking account. A paper trail so clean, it almost insulted the chaos Marianne was trying to create around it. Not because Evelyn planned to shame them publicly. She didn't. But because she knew now what she should have known years earlier. When people have benefited from your silence, they tend to panic when confronted with records. Saturday evening, Sylvia called again. Pastor Helen asked your mother during women's fellowship whether you were doing all right, she said. Your mother cried, and said she didn't know. First time I've seen her not have a full script ready. Evelyn looked out the office window toward the water beyond the marina, sun flashing orange against the glass. Maybe because for the first time, she can't control the story with one sentence. Sylvia was quiet for a moment. Then she said, For what it's worth, honey, I was there that night. I know what happened. Evelyn swallowed hard. It was the first time anyone in her family had said those words plainly. After the call, she stayed at her desk long after everyone else left, one hand resting on the stack of documents beside her. In Maple Grove, Marianne was discovering what bills looked like when they arrived addressed to reality instead of to Evelyn. Chloe was learning that outrage did not make payments. Dennis was finally being forced to read numbers he had spent years ignoring. And somewhere beneath all that unraveling, the truth was rising in plain sight. Not that Evelyn had abandoned them, that they had built their comfort on a woman they never thought would walk away. By the second week of August, Evelyn had stopped checking her phone with dread and started checking it with detachment. The messages from Maple Grove had settled into a pattern so predictable it almost felt procedural. Marianne alternated between wounded motherhood and cold accusation. Chloe texted only when a consequence became immediate enough to ruin her day. Dennis called rarely, usually late, usually after Marianne had worked herself into a panic and pushed the phone into his hand. The emotional weather back home kept shifting, but the pressure system never changed. None of them missed Evelyn. They missed access. Then Dee Sylvia called with the kind of strained excitement that always meant fresh damage. "Your mother saw a post online," she said without preamble. "About your company." Evelyn looked up from the draft contract on her desk. "What post?" "Some woman named Karen from Charlotte shared pictures from a business networking event in Florida. Your name was in the caption. Then someone else tagged your firm. Marianne saw it in the church group because Pastor Helen's niece knows Karen somehow." Sylvia took a breath. "That's not even the main part. In one of the photos, there's a sign behind you. Hart and Bennett Advisory. And another picture." She hesitated. "And another picture what?" "A porch, ocean in the background." For a moment, Evelyn said nothing. Through the office window, late afternoon light was spilling across the marina, turning the anchored boats into strips of white and gold. Somewhere beyond the conference room, Camila was laughing at something one of the junior analysts said. The world on her side of the glass remained orderly, earned, intact. On the other end of the call, Sylvia lowered her voice. "Your mother asked if that was your house." Evelyn leaned back in her chair. "And what did you say?" "The truth. I said I didn't know because no one here ever bothered to ask you anything." A sharp, humorless smile passed across Evelyn's face. How did she take that? She went pale first. Then Chloe started yelling. "Your father left the room." Of course he had. Sylvia told her what happened next in fragments. The way people do when they've just witnessed a scene that was both ugly and absurd. Marianne had stared at the photos like they were evidence of a crime. Chloe had demanded to know how Evelyn could own property in Florida while letting her car situation collapse. Dennis had said almost nothing, only sat down heavily at the kitchen table and rubbed both hands over his face. Pastor Helen, who had happened to be there dropping off a casserole because apparently public righteousness had lately become more exhausting than usual, had gone very quiet. Then Marianne had said the sentence Evelyn should have expected all along. "We're going to Florida. No invitation. No request to talk. No shame. Just intention." Evelyn thanked Sylvia, ended the call, and sat still for a long moment with the phone in her hand. She was not afraid, exactly. Marianne's power had always depended on private rooms, hometown loyalties, and the old family script where Evelyn entered already guilty. Florida was different, so was Evelyn. But that did not mean the confrontation would be painless. Some conflicts stop hurting the moment you understand them. Others hurt in new ways because you finally do. 3 days later, Hart and Bennett hosted a client reception at the beach house. It was not supposed to be dramatic. Noah had organized it as a small evening gathering to celebrate a major consulting agreement with a regional hospitality group, half networking event, half thank you dinner for existing clients and referral partners. The house looked beautiful in the kind of understated way Evelyn had always loved most. The porch lights cast a warm amber glow across the deck. Glass doors stood open to the breeze. Camila had arranged white flowers in low bowls on the dining table, and Luis's brother, who ran a catering company, had set out trays of crab cakes, citrus shrimp, and tiny toasts layered with whipped goat cheese and roasted tomatoes. Beyond the railing, the ocean moved in dark silk under the evening sky. Evelyn wore a navy dress she had bought for investor meetings and never needed until now. Noah stood near the bar in a charcoal jacket, greeting guests with easy confidence, while Camila steered conversation and logistics with the grace of someone who could keep a train station running through a hurricane. For the first hour, everything unfolded exactly as it should have. Clients laughed. Business cards changed hands. Someone complimented the view. Someone else asked about expansion along the coast. Evelyn moved through the rooms with a calm that felt earned down to the bone. Then the front door opened. She knew before she turned. There are certain presences your body remembers before your mind catches up the shift in air. The silence that spreads and ripples, the tiny pause in other people's voices when something personal and unwelcome crosses into a professional room. Evelyn looked toward the foyer and saw Marianne first. Her mother had dressed for the occasion in the most deliberate way possible. Pearls, soft blue blouse, linen slacks, the exact image of respectable Southern womanhood. Chloe stood half a step behind her in white jeans and borrowed confidence, eyes already moving around the room with open calculation. Dennis came last, shoulders heavy, looking as though he had hoped until the final second that the drive might somehow be cancelled by weather or fate or a hole in the road big enough to save him from having to choose a side in public. Conversation around them thinned, then faltered. Noah set down his drink and moved. Not toward the door exactly, but close enough to Evelyn that no one in the room could mistake where he stood. Camila did the same from the other side, saying nothing. Their silence steadied her more than words could have. Marianne's eyes swept the room, taking in the windows, the caterers, the guests, the ocean beyond the glass, and finally the subtle brass plaque beside the hallway archway, Hart and Bennett Advisory Coastal Office. When she looked back at Evelyn, her expression was a blend of injury and disbelief, so intense it would have been almost theatrical if it weren't so familiar. "How could you hide all this from your family?" she asked. There it was. Not hello. Not can we talk. Not I was wrong. That question. Not what she had done to Evelyn. What Evelyn had failed to disclose to her. The old script, arriving right on time, only this time, it had walked into the wrong house. Evelyn set her glass down with deliberate care and turned fully toward her mother. Around them, the room had gone still in that unmistakable way people do when they sense something real is about to be said and know better than to interrupt it. The ocean moved behind the windows, in dark, steady bands. Somewhere near the dining table, a fork touched a plate and then stopped. "Hide?" Evelyn repeated, her voice calm enough to carry. "You cleared out my bedroom before I got home the night I lost my job." Marianne's face tightened. "That is not what this is about." "No," Evelyn said. "It's exactly what this is about." Chloe stepped forward before her mother could answer, indignation already rising like heat off pavement. "You had all this the whole time," she said, sweeping one hand toward the house, the guests, the open doors, the water beyond them, "and you still let my car get taken?" A few people in the room exchanged glances. Noah said nothing, but Evelyn could feel his presence beside her like a wall that didn't need to announce itself. Evelyn looked at her sister for a long second. "I didn't let anything happen to your car, Chloe. I paid for it far longer than I ever should have. That's not fair. Neither was being packed into bins and sent out of a house I was paying to keep standing." That landed. Evelyn saw it move through the room, not as gossip but as understanding. Faces changed, shoulders shifted. The story Marianne had probably told herself on the drive down the one where she was the wounded mother and Evelyn the cold, secretive daughter began to die in public. Marianne lowered her voice, but that only made it sharper. "You are trying to humiliate us." Evelyn felt something cold and clear settle into place. "No, I'm refusing to keep protecting you from the truth." Then, because the moment had finally come, and she was tired of carrying everyone else's version of it, she said it plainly. "I paid the mortgage on your house for 5 years. I covered Dad's insurance for 7. I made the payments on Chloe's car for a year and a half. And the night I came home, after being laid off, you gave my room away before I even walked through the door." No one moved. Chloe opened her mouth, then closed it again. Marianne's expression fractured not into guilt, not quite, but into the anger of someone realizing her audience had changed sides. Dennis stood behind them both, his face drained of color, his eyes fixed not on Evelyn but on the floor. At last he lifted his head. "I'm sorry," he said. "Just that. No excuse." "No," your mother thought. "No, we were under stress." The words sounded rough in his mouth, like something dragged over stone, but they were real. Evelyn looked at him and felt the ache of all the years that should have held those words and never did. "Thank you," she said quietly. Marian turned to him in disbelief. "Dennis," but he didn't look at her. For once, he looked only at Evelyn, and in that brief, painful moment, she saw something she had wanted her whole life and no longer needed in the same desperate way. Recognition. It should have ended there. It didn't. 3 weeks later, after the Lexus was gone, after the mortgage warning became official, after Chloe moved back into the same house she had once rushed to redecorate, Marianne met with a lawyer. There was no case, of course. No legal claim to the beach house. No mechanism to force an adult daughter to continue financing the lives of people who had used her up. But that didn't stop her from trying. According to Sylvia, Marianne told anyone willing to listen that Evelyn had abandoned family after everything we invested in her. Pastor Helen quietly stopped bringing the subject up. Chloe posted a quote about betrayal and blood. No one ever apologized in the full, honest way the damage deserved. That was the part that stung most in the end. Not that they lost the money. Not even that they lost access. It was that even after the truth stood in full light, Marianne still could not see a daughter where she had once seen a resource. On the first cool evening in September, Evelyn stood alone on the back porch of the beach house and looked out at the water as the sun dropped low and red across the horizon. Inside, on the dining table, lay a copy of the lawyer's letter Marianne had sent, and Camila's notes beside it. The house was quiet except for the waves and the distant rattle of dishes from the kitchen. Evelyn wrapped her arms around herself and let the salt air move over her skin. She had once thought the worst pain was being thrown out. It wasn't. The worst pain was realizing some people can know exactly what they did to you and still only grieve the loss of your usefulness. That was the lesson. That was the wound. And at last, it was also the line she would never let anyone cross again.